What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze Apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're taking another look at questioning Christianity, and he's looking to support that Jesus existed. Now, just to put this into perspective, he is an evangelical Christian, so he is not arguing for a minimal historical Jesus. He's arguing for the very magical wizard that supposedly existed in the first century. So, we're gonna be arguing on those grounds here, I'm guessing. And this is just me predicting what might be in the video. I don't know. I actually haven't watched the video yet, so you're getting a very raw reaction or response from me here. But my guess is that he's gonna heavily rely on the Gospels as well as maybe some outside evidence like to the Bible. I don't know. We'll have to see. But if you want to fuck around and find out how this evangelical is going to prove that Jesus actually existed in history, then please stay tuned.
For decades, Christian advocates have been trotting out C.S. Lewis's famous trilemma. That given the things Jesus said about himself, he must be either a diabolical deceiver, psychologically unhinged, or else God incarnate. Supposedly those were the only three logical options: liar, lunatic, or Lord. But in recent years, it's become increasingly popular in skeptical circles to suggest a fourth option, a legend. That the stories of Jesus are historical fabrications. That Jesus of Nazareth never existed, and if he did, that he had nothing to do with the founding of Christianity. Those who promote this view are often termed Jesus mythicists, and whilst its academic defenders like George Albert Wells, Richard Carrier, and Robert Price are astonishingly few in number, for some reason, when surveyed, a surprising number of adults across the Western world expressed serious doubt over whether Jesus of Nazareth ever even existed.
Good. People should. I do feel like people need to start questioning the evidence for Jesus. And I'm not saying that you should definitely become a mythicist or anything like that, but I would like it if more people started to question the evidence usually used to support Jesus's existence and actually be skeptical about it. I see, because of some of the circles that I run in, I do see some people doing that, and there are plenty of them out there. Even on this channel, I've noticed how some people have taken notice of the inadequacy of the explanations that plenty of historicists come up with for the supposed facts of Jesus. But I do wish more people would start doing that. So yay. Yeah, well, progress is being made on this front. Way to go. But I would also say that a lot of the individual components of the minimal mythicist hypothesis is supported by mainstream scholarship. And there are a lot of factors that play into the determination of Jesus' existence that are mainstream ideas. But a lot of people don't want to acknowledge them, that they are mainstream ideas, in the context of it factoring into mythicism. There are a lot of assumptions that are inherently foisted upon this discussion. Like, for instance, with the suffering and dying Messiah motif that existed prior to Christianity. You will have plenty of scholars out there like Jason Staples, as well as I'm sure many of the people that established that there was a pre-Christian motif about a suffering and dying Messiah that will say that, you know, it's only done in retrospect, like the Jesus's followers in retrospect found this motif. But I don't really see any reason to automatically assume that Jesus had to have died in order for that retrospective to happen. Like, what if there were just people that assumed the Messiah was going to come, and then when the Messiah did not come, there was no actual public ministry or any kind of public thing about this Messiah? What if the time for him to come had come and gone with nothing, and that caused them to do a retrospective and to find these various motifs in Jewish literature that definitely existed prior to Christianity, and they put it together at that point. My point is that I don't see anything that definitely requires Jesus to have existed for any of it to actually have come into existence or to be thought of.
So what does the Christian story say about whether Jesus is history? Did Jesus really exist? Well, despite the popularity of the non-existence hypothesis on a street level and in skeptical online forums, it might be helpful to consider just how fringe this view is when it comes to mainstream scholarship.
Is that really a determination of truth, though? Because there was a time when evolution was a fringe idea in science, and there have been plenty of other scientific concepts that were fringe ideas until more people looked at the question or looked at the evidence and became convinced. It's just that in science, generally speaking, there's not this religious bias to not honestly look at the evidence. And that's what we see in the academic scholarship. Now, I do contend that it is seriously being questioned in the scholarship. Like, there are plenty of scholars, I believe the last count was, 40 or so, that are either mythicist, agnostic, or are sympathetic to the mythicist question of whether or not Jesus existed. This issue is seriously discussed in academia. It's not just some online thing, and it's not just only in atheist circles or anything like that. This is actually being discussed in academia. So he's already starting off on a bad foot by appealing to consensus as a measurement of truth, or at least poisoning the well of mythicism by saying that it's a fringe idea. Now, mind you, in the circles that he's talking about, the academic circles, the academic paradigm that he's talking about, the idea that Jesus did not historically resurrect is also a fringe idea. As Bart Ehrman would say, people that don't believe in a historical resurrection are odd ducks in that area of academia. And they will continue to be, because the primary people to occupy jobs in this area are going to be Christians. Now, that's not to say that they can't do good scholarship or that they haven't produced good scholarship. It just means that you have to be skeptical of their scholarly conclusions. You have to analyze what their conclusions are and what evidence they have to support it, because what will pass muster and peer review is what I mean in the New Testament scholarship arena is vastly different than what will pass peer review in like scientific areas. It's very different.
Even Bart Ehrman, certainly no friend of Christianity, set out to explicitly refute Jesus' mythicists in his book, Did Jesus Exist? Because despite being an agnostic Bible scholar, he argues that the evidence for Jesus is so overwhelming that to deny it would be called silly.
Well, I've obviously got my issues with Bart's defense of the historical Jesus, and basically where I disagree with Bart and is on basic historical methodology concerning the New Testament and what we can know to be true about Jesus. And the methodology surrounding that. Because from what I've heard from Bart, which he kind of alluded to in the interview that I did with Bart, was relying on the sources behind the Gospels. And the problem that I have with that in applying historical methodology is that we can't actually scrutinize those sources, because those sources are either oral sources or they're theoretical and hypothetical documents that people have reconstructed, but they've reconstructed them based on little to no evidence other than their own speculative ideas about what was in it. And I feel like there's no way to know where that information came from that they're identifying as being in those hypothetical sources. So I disagree with Bart on the independence of those sources, because there's simply no way for us to know if they were independent. I mean, I do agree it's possible that they were all independent, the sources behind the Gospels, like the Q document, the M document, L document, and all that. I think that it's possible that they are independent of one another, but I think that it's also as equally possible that they are dependent on each other, like in the same ways that Mark came first, Matthew depends on Mark, and then Luke depends on both Matthew and Mark. Like, it could be dependent in that way. And even then, even if we could whittle it down to just like there's one document that all this stems from, we don't have that document. We don't have those oral sources to be able to determine whether or not they actually trace back to historical information. At some point, you have to assume that they do in order to make the case that they do trace back to some historical facts. So I'm not convinced by that argument. And that seems to be what Bart Ehrman's main argument is for historical facts about Jesus. And then, of course, there's the different Pauline verses and everything like that we could argue day in and day out about. My point is that the historicist argument ultimately relies on ad hoc speculation in order to make its case. And I feel like the minimal mythicist hypothesis doesn't have to do that, because it uses the available evidence in order to justify a probabilistic claim about the historicity of Jesus. And to me, it's convincing that considering all the figures similar to Jesus that we have, where similar things are said about Jesus as these other pagan and mystery faith gods, it seems more likely that Jesus would have been just as made up as those other gods. It's just that Jesus has a Jewish background, whereas these other gods have their own cultural background. So that's where I disagree with Bart on. I have to say that whenever Bart's been challenged on these things, I have not found them to be satisfying. Like, his responses have not been satisfying to me. But I'm always continuously trying to learn and trying to understand better. And I think that my understanding is getting better all the time. So, I don't know. Let's continue with what this guy has to say about the historicity of Jesus.
John Dixon, an ancient historian who teaches on the historical Jesus, he went public on his social media a few years ago with a challenge that he would eat a page of his Bible if someone could name a single credentialed professor of classics, ancient history, or New Testament studies who holds a post in a reputable university anywhere in the world, but who denies that Jesus existed.
Why does this matter? As far as like a historical investigation to the historicity of Jesus, why does this matter? Does this matter at all? I don't think that it should. Like, you could have asked this same question 100 years ago about Moses and the other patriarchs, and you wouldn't have anybody in any reputable institution that would have said, yeah, Moses wasn't a real person. You wouldn't find any professor or teacher, anybody in a professional capacity in any reputable institution that would say that Moses wasn't a historical figure. They would all have agreed that he was most likely a historical figure, but through analyzing the evidence and new evidence that was found and new arguments developed surrounding the Pentateuch and the Torah and all that, it eventually led to the conclusion that Moses and the other patriarchs most likely didn't exist. And you will find plenty of people in reputable institutions now that hold that position because it's been tested by time and other scholars that have come along. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't detractors to it, but my point is that just because a position isn't being held by, people in professional positions and institutions and all that does not mean that the position is false. It has nothing to do with the position. It's only about who are convinced. And this is yet another argument from authority. And argument from authority is a fallacy. And it's when you use the authorities in order to prove that something is true rather than appealing to the evidence that the authorities use. And that's the big distinction there, is that yes, like evolution is built upon mountains of evidence, and all of the authorities agree that evolution happens and it's real. But evolution isn't real and happens because the authorities say so. We know that it happens because of the evidence that is used by the authorities. So the question that we have to ask in this situation isn't who accepts this position, it's what is the evidence do the people that run counter to this position use to refute the position? What evidence do these people use to support the contrary conclusion? That's what we have to look at. But historicists don't like doing that, just like this guy right here. He doesn't like doing that because the evidence is hard. It's hard to explain. It's hard to understand. It's just hard in general. It's easier to just appeal to the authorities on the matter. Oh, well, everybody thinks so. Well, if everybody thought they could fly and they started jumping off a cliff, would you be the first one to jump off the cliff? Because I feel like the argument that he's making is like, name one person in a reputable position that thinks that we can't fly. You can't? Well, then my ass is jumping off this fucking cliff.
To date, John's Bible remains whole. Now, my goal with this observation is not to belittle Jesus' mythicists, nor simply to flex the academic muscles of the majority. And no doubt appeals to authority can fall into the trap of being unduly dismissive, substituting real evidence and arguments simply for expert opinions as though piling up academic credentials is enough to make the case.
I mean, I kind of agree with him here. I mean, he's basically saying what I just ranted about. Again, he's not saying like, oh, let's just pile up the credentials as if that's a detriment to the mythicists or something like that. I'd rather him focus on the fact that just because a bunch of people with credentials say something is real doesn't mean that it is real. It's the evidence that makes it real.
My point is simply to demonstrate that sometimes popular beliefs can be out of step with informed scholarly consensus. And when it comes to whether Jesus is history, this broad consensus is not ideologically driven. These academic fields are populated by non-religious scholars too, with no motivated axe to grind and often a whole range of opinions as to who Jesus really was.
I often hear this claim, but I rarely ever hear anybody list off scholars, like secular scholars, that are invested in the topic of the historicity of Jesus and meet this criteria. Like, of course, you could talk about Bart Ehrman for days, but Bart Ehrman is just one person. And I'm sure that there are others out there that are atheists. I guess this is still all just sort of part of a larger argument from authority. I mean, he kind of shat on the idea of an argument from authority as being dismissive, which it's not necessarily dismissive. I don't take it as being dismissive. I take it as being uninformed. I feel like at this point, with the evidence being questioned, you can't just appeal to the consensus anymore. You have to address the evidence and show how the evidence definitely proves that Jesus existed, instead of focusing on who holds this position. I don't care who holds this position. And I feel like if you have integrity, you're not going to care about who holds the position. You're not going to care about what professors hold the position or whether or not professors hold this position, because they can be wrong. Now, that's not to say that I think that I'm better than any New Testament professor or anything like that, but I do think that there are plenty of people in the field of New Testament studies, and as well as Old Testament, like Torah, Pentateuch, rabbinical studies, that shed light on many of the assumptions that historicists make that are just out of step with what is actually mainstream and what is actually argued and better argued by other people. I just totally disagree with this focus on who holds the position, and I would rather focus on what the evidence is that supports the position.
But this monolithic conviction of these diverse scholars that Jesus really existed, it comes down to one simple reality: the strength of the historical evidence. So what is the evidence for the historical Jesus? Well, first, we have Christian sources, the ones that make up the New Testament. Our earliest known sources for the historicity of Jesus, they come from a series of letters written by the Apostle Paul. Penned within 3 decades of Jesus' death and some much earlier, Paul makes mention of a number of historical claims about Jesus. That Jesus was a Jew, born of a woman and descended genealogically from King David himself.
Technically, that's not what Paul says. Paul routinely uses words more indicative of being made or manufactured. Now, whether or not that means that God made or manufactured Jesus in Mary's womb, or if God made or manufactured Jesus's body in a more celestial or divine realm, that's up for discussion. Like that's an argument. But strictly speaking, what he said here is not what Paul says. Paul specifically states that Jesus was made. He does say that he was descended from David, but in what way? That would be another discussion to be had. In what way was Paul mentioning this? Because both a figurative sense and a literal sense both make sense of what Paul said. So we have to make the determination of which one he meant. And I feel like normally speaking of other people, we wouldn't have to make this particular nuanced decision, right, as to what Paul meant. But considering that Jesus was supposedly a magical wizard divinely inhabited by some Messiah, I feel like that warrants questioning what Paul actually meant. Also, in case you're wondering, I have a Godless Engineer Clips channel that I'll link down below, some pertinent information about these various passages talking about Jesus's lineage. So if you want to go and check that out, please do down in the description below.
That Jesus had brothers, one of whom was James, that he had 12 disciples, naming Peter and John specifically, that Jesus taught on marriage, that he summarized the Jewish law in terms of compassion, and that he said he would return in glory.
Well, so about half of those things come from the Gospels, which is not in Paul. Paul doesn't mention those things. Paul does mention a James, calling him the brother of the Lord. I will also have a link down below in the description that covers that particular discussion. The question is, what kind of brother was Paul indicating James was, because there's a possibility that brother of the Lord was just how Christians referred to themselves before the word Christian came into being. Being a brother of the Lord seems to indicate a cultic title or, a fictive kinship rather than a blood relation, because Jesus wasn't known as the Lord until after he died and resurrected. I feel like there's a solid case to be made that he doesn't mean a literal blood relative, but rather just a fellow brother in Christ, brother of the Lord, like a brother in their religion, a fictive kinship. Paul never uses the word disciple. He never talks about the disciples. He does mention apostles, and he mentions James and John, Peter as being pillars in the early church, as being apostles. He does mention very vaguely the 12 in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, but doesn't necessarily mean the 12 are the disciples. If he were to mean that the 12 were disciples, then why didn't he just include Peter in the 12? It could be, I guess, that Peter was appeared to individually while Jesus appeared to the 12 disciples as a group, like there's just a separate group. The grammar in that section does seem to indicate that Peter is separate from the 12, but also who were the 12? Right after Jesus resurrected, were there 12 disciples? In the Gospels, there was only 11 because Judas, he ran, and I can't recall right now when they selected the second 12th disciple. But it just kind of seems weird to portray all of this as if these are grounded historical facts when literally none of them are.
That Jesus shared a last meal with his disciples, that he was betrayed by one of his own, that he was crucified and buried and then raised bodily on the third day from the dead, and that he appeared to a litany of witnesses. Paul's claims here are then corroborated and fleshed out further in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which were penned roughly around the same time and certainly within living memory of the events that they described. Along with John's Gospel, written decades later, these 4 biographies contain the hallmarks of genuine eyewitness testimony from people who knew Jesus firsthand. Add to this then the rest of the New Testament documents, including letters from James and Jude as 2 of Jesus' half-brothers, and you have a compelling case.
This is not a compelling case. Him referencing the Gospels as being eyewitness accounts or some kind of direct evidence of Jesus, that's just ridiculous. Like I said before with the Bart Ehrman section, we can't actually scrutinize where this information came from, and the only indications we get from the actual Gospels are that scriptures were used. And then, of course, through textual analysis, we've been able to discover that they used each other. Luke used both Matthew and Mark. Matthew used Mark. Mark used Paul. John used definitely Luke, but more than likely he knew all 3 Gospels. And of course, I'm guessing Paul's letters, because Paul's letters were integral to the Christian movement. So really, to me, it seems like most of this comes down to purely Paul and what he said, because that's our first writing that we have about Jesus. And since we can't scrutinize the sources behind the Gospels other than just vaguely the scriptures that support a lot of the information in the Gospels, it seems like Paul is the only evidence that we have that we can scrutinize, and Paul is very vague about Jesus and whether or not he was on earth. This does not seem like a very good case because it heavily relies on information that we either can dispute and discuss because it's vague, and there are arguments on both sides about what he means, so there's no definitive answer. And there's also evidence in the form of hypothetical sources or real sources like the Gospels themselves, but the Gospels themselves are definitely not eyewitness accounts. So this is just simply not a good case for a historical Jesus, and it all ultimately relies on a man who supposedly received visions or hallucinations from Jesus, and he read the scriptures a lot. That seems to be what the Christian religion is based on, as far as we can tell in a concrete way.
Second, we have the Apostolic Fathers outside the New Testament. These are the second generation of church leaders at the end of the 1st century and the start of the 2nd century. Christians like Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias. all of whom speak of Jesus, and most of whom likely knew apostles personally, receiving from them their testimony about Jesus.
So this also is not a good way to determine anything about Jesus. For one thing, you can already tell in the way he talks about these second generation church fathers, their connection with the disciples. It's very ad hoc and speculative. And so that just goes to show that there's no real evidence that they had any kind of contact with any disciples. They could have had contact, I guess, with people that knew, but there's no direct contact with anybody that claims to have known anything about Jesus, like while he was on earth. Also, I would note that pretty much anybody in the second century, which is nearly everybody that he talked about there, none of them are going to have firsthand information about Jesus. They're far too late. They came into it far too late in order to be able to know anybody with firsthand knowledge. And so that goes along with his ad hoc speculative nature about who had contact with the original disciples. I get it that if you're a very gullible person, very gullible Christian type person, you could understand like, oh yeah, second generation people had contact with first generation people. But the people that he's talking about are far removed from whenever if there were disciples, they would have died off, because the disciples, they would have started dying off when the gospels were being written. And that's just a brutal fact about the first century, considering the fact that, these people have always been portrayed as being peasants and not like wealthy elites. Because the wealthy elites were like on the Pharisees' side as far as Jews go. They would have been there. That's why the Gospels and Paul, they have geared their message to the underprivileged in Jewish society, and they are against those of higher privilege. And you see that with like the themes of the least shall be first and all of that stuff. Paul himself was like a very learned Jew, so he was educated. He would have been part of a small percentage of Jews that had education, but he had his experience or whatnot that caused him to turn to join the Christian movement, which seemed to be populated by those of this least status instead of the most, given that later gospels were written to focus on those that were underprivileged in Jewish society. Seems to at least lend a pretty strong argument to that's who was accepting and adopting the religion, not the Jewish elites, but the poor people, the Gentiles, those types of people. So, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to sit there and be like, oh yeah, they had direct access to the disciples, when the disciples were probably, more than likely, as far as all of our information indicates, if there were disciples, they would have been dead.
Now, secular historians, they take these Christian sources seriously. Just because these first Christians were persuaded that Jesus was who he claimed to be, Lord, that doesn't nullify their worth as historical sources. Now, obviously, critical scholars don't take everything these Christian sources say as gospel truth, swallowing Jesus' miracles wholesale, for instance. If they did that, they'd all become Christians. No, they weigh individual claims from within these sources, looking to see if they satisfy a range of criteria so that they can confidently affirm what happens in history.
Yeah. And are we going to discuss what that criteria is? Because I'd love to have a discussion on that criteria.
But let's say you're skeptical of these sources. I mean, Christians are biased, right? Surely we can't trust the motives of these morally transformed people, the ones who spent their lives sacrificially serving the poor.
Well, I don't think that their bias precludes them from being historical sources. I think that they can be historical sources, like we can use them as historical sources, even though they contain some magical stuff. It's all about where they got their information from. Were they actual eyewitness sources? And our information indicates that the gospel writers were definitely not eyewitnesses. The people that wrote the gospels would have been educated in pagan schools, which factors into a number of other arguments about the construction of the gospels, but we'll just focus on the fact that these Jews, they were educated, and the people that were supposedly Jesus's disciples were not educated, and they did not have time to become educated. So They literally could not have been the authors of the Gospels. Now, of course, you've got some people out there that are like, oh, well, John Mark was, an assistant to Peter, and he got his information from Peter. Well, where do we have that information? It's speculative. Like, it's an ad hoc speculative statement about who wrote the Gospel of Mark, when in reality, all we have as far as who wrote the Gospel of Mark is a bumblefuck Papias in the 2nd century claiming that certain people wrote these things. And that's it. Just a mere assertion that they did. No actual proof that they did. We don't have any textual evidence that has like, oh, by the way, I'm John Mark. I'm writing this because I heard it from Peter. Like, there's no textual variant out there that has that in the Gospel of Mark. All we have are ad hoc speculative claims made by bumblefuck priests like Papias in the 2nd century, and then later priests in the later parts of the 2nd century just reaffirm what the earlier priests said. It's a giant fucking circle jerk about who authored the fucking Bible.
Or surely we should doubt the intelligence of these witnesses who, penned some of the most incredible literature in the ancient world. But even if you are skeptical and throughout all of these Christian sources, you're still in luck. Why? Because third, Jesus is better attested in non-Christian sources than nearly anyone outside of the Roman emperors. And that is no small feat for an obscure itinerant preacher from a backwater Roman province. See, across the ancient records, there are numerous mentions of Jesus. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, the Roman historian Tacitus, the Roman magistrate Pliny the Younger, the Greek satirist Lucian, and even the Babylonian Talmud.
Sorry, I know it was continuing there, but I just got to insert real quick. So starting from the top, Josephus, those were later interpolations. The first one, the Testimonium Flavianum, was a malicious interpolation, while the second one, the James reference, is an accidental interpolation by a scribe, at some point in history, accidentally interpolating that information into the text. Tacitus does not actually prove that Jesus existed, only refers to what Jewish Christians believed in the second half of the 1st century. So not proof. Pliny the Younger, he was reporting about what Christians believed, not like an actual firsthand account of, Jesus existing or anything like that. Lucian of Samosata, he is probably like between a 2nd and 3rd century source who was just reporting what he had tangentially heard about Christians at the time. And then finally, there's the Babylonian Talmud. And scholars have identified the Babylonian Talmud as referencing only one Jesus, and that was a Jesus that existed under King Janaeus at the beginning of the 1st century BCE, right around like 80 BCE or so. And so this was, well around 100 years prior to when Jesus was supposed to have come. And so that Jesus could not have been the Jesus that started Christianity, because Christianity most notably seemed to have started sometime in the first half of the 1st century, around the 30s or so, CE. So that one's definitely not a historical reference to Jesus. None of his extra biblical sources that account for, Jesus being the most attested outside of the Bible historical figure don't actually reference any of them. I'll also have all the links down below to further explanations about these sources. I have videos I've already done on the counter arguments for each of these sources and how they don't actually prove anything about a historical Jesus. They just talk about what Christians believe, which is not a historical source for what happened to Jesus, because the Christians were tainted by the Gospels. So I have all that down below. Let's see where he's going now.
In fact, no less than 12 non-sympathetic sources in the first 2 centuries AD mention Jesus.
They mention beliefs about Jesus. They don't actually mention Jesus, because even the Josephus claims, those are beliefs about Jesus. Those aren't actual references to Jesus. So, well, with the exception of the James reference, which is an interpolation, because Christians who were maintaining Josephus's work, they were inserting their beliefs about who Christ was and all that kind of stuff. But like I said, Those links are down below in the description.
Often corroborating some of the New Testament's claims with independent details. Now, one of Josephus's references to Jesus, the Testimonium Flavianum, is disputed because it seems a later Christian scribe edited his original words. But even cutting this out, there is plenty of secular evidence to affirm Jesus existed.
Most people already cut Josephus out because of how contested it is. Most of them just appeal to the second one, which they have a better chance at, but I don't find their arguments convincing that, that James is the literal brother of Jesus, so Jesus definitely existed. I feel like there's a lot of problems with that explanation, but I've got all that covered in my video down below.
In total, were you to pile up all the sources together, the Jewish, Christian, and Greco-Roman accounts, there are 42 different sources for the historical Jesus that were all penned while Christianity was still a tiny rogue religious contingent in the ancient world.
And they all only reference what Christians believed about Jesus and not whether or not Jesus actually existed. So nice doing the legwork. Well, I mean, you're really just reading a claim by somebody else, but it would be nice for you to list all the 42 sources so that we could actually scrutinize them, because all of the sources that this guy has named already, I've been able to scrutinize immediately and show how they're not references to a historical Jesus. Even just rhetorically, I've been able to do that. Further explanations, of course, in the description, but you get my point.
So the non-existence hypothesis, the idea that Jesus was just a historical fabrication, it just does not stand up under scrutiny. And there is a reason why secular scholars in this field consider Jesus mythicists to be the ideological equivalents of flat earthers.
You see, I really hate this particular comparison, not because I am a mythicist and I don't like flat earthers. It's because it's totally contrary to minimal mythicism, like this whole idea that we're just flat earthers. Because, and here's the big difference, is that minimal mythicism takes all the evidence into account concerning Jesus and his existence, even from an a fortiori position, which means to the strongest historicist position, we try to give as much ground, like in the minimal mythicist hypothesis, it tries to give as much ground to the historicist position as reasonably possible. Even doing that, we only come up with, about a 33% chance that Jesus was historical, which is pretty much unfazed from the starting likelihood based off of the background evidence, which points to a 33% chance. So the evidence that's typically provided as evidence of Jesus hardly even moves the needle on his existence. And so I feel like if flat earthers were to do that, take all the information into account, if there's still flat earthers after taking all the information into account, you can easily identify where they're fucking up. Like for flat earthers, they totally disregard the images we have from like the space station or from the numerous satellites that have taken pictures of the Earth. They totally throw that out as being fake. So they, assign a probability to them proving, a spherical Earth as near zero as they could possibly do it, if not zero itself. And so that's one place where you could point at and be like, see, that's where you're fucking up. And plenty of people have attempted to do this for mythicism, but the problem is that whenever they're like, you see right there, you're fucking up. When you look at where they're pointing at as far as where the minimal mythicist position fucks up in its analysis, you'll see that it's a very minute detail that is even admitted to be hotly debated, and it depends on how you take that particular piece of evidence. And somebody might hone in on, well, you see right there, Galatians 4:4, that's where you're fucking up. And it's like, well, if we actually analyze Galatians 4:4 in its broader context, and we look at the words that Paul uses, how does that compare to the similar phrases and words that are used in the Old Testament when they're mentioning stuff and all this other stuff? Like, you can do an analysis of it and show why the minimal mythicist argument has come to a certain conclusion on it. Now, for that one, I do believe the minimal mythicist hypothesis counts that as evidence of historicity. It's just not strong evidence. It's definitely not strong enough to overcome the prior probability that we've already assigned to Jesus. And that's due to the type of figure, the type of wizard that Jesus is portrayed as. So I feel like you like, and on both ideas, you can pinpoint where they're fucking up. It's just that on mythicism, where people are fucking up, they point to where mythicism fucks up. They're generally only focusing on the actual minimal mythicist conclusion to it instead of the a priori conclusion that takes it as evidence of Jesus's existence. It's just that they're angry that you're not counting this as 100%. Like, this is definitely proof that Jesus existed and it should blow the prior probability out of the water. Like, that's how they feel that evidence affects it, when it's really just, here's one word that Paul uses. What does he mean by that? And that's it. Like, it seems so ridiculous on the historicist side.
Because they just don't seem to be willing to go where the evidence overwhelmingly points. And so, since truth invites questioning, you are invited to explore this historical evidence for Jesus for yourself, asking what makes the most sense of the claims in these sources. Was Jesus just a liar, cunningly deceiving those around him? Was he a lunatic, psychologically unstable and so confused about his true identity? Or was he truly Lord, and so worthy of our trust as the one who promises eternal life? Given the weight of historical evidence, it would seem the one thing we cannot say is that Jesus of Nazareth was nothing more than a legend.
And I just simply disagree, because there's enough Jewish background to where somebody could have fabricated the Jesus story. Like, all of the tenets of the Jesus story you can find in Judaism. And you can find Jews creating peshers in the first century that effectively say the same thing as what Jesus is claimed to have said, done, or Jesus's theology. So, I mean, you can construct all of that out of existing Jewish ideas. Now, the thing that a lot of people assume is that the followers of Jesus would have only thought to have done this with the scriptures, like pull stuff from the scriptures, identify things in the scriptures, and use Jewish ideas in order to justify that Jesus was the Messiah, was because he died on the cross, and that wasn't expected. But in reality, I don't see a difference between Jesus actually dying and his followers looking for those excuses in the scriptures, and people expecting a Messiah to come and expect the Messiah not coming, and then these disappointed Jews try to find some kind of excuse in the scriptures to make sense of why the Messiah didn't come. And I see both of those have equal possibilities. And I think based on the evidence that we have, the plausibility is more so on the mythicist idea that the Messiah just didn't come, and so the Jews fabricated information about the Messiah because he didn't come, and that's how Christianity started. I feel like the evidence definitely points in that direction as opposed to the other direction. And this is just one minute detail that historicists and mythicists are disagreeing on. It's really not that big of a deal. It's not as massive as the flat earth debate. The divide is so small that it's hard to really tell a difference, at least for me, because Jesus could have existed and all of this shit was fabricated around his existence. The Jesus that we know now, that Paul knew, could have no relation to the real Jesus that existed. But we have to go with what evidence that we do have, and the evidence that we do have does not suggest that any kind of figure known as Jesus, or that had a following or had followers, started Christianity or was at the heart of Christianity. The evidence just doesn't lean that way for me. That's it. This isn't some radical claim about the shape of the earth. And it's just ridiculous to portray it that way. That's going to be it for this guy's video. I hope that you guys enjoyed my rants here on his take on the historicity of Jesus. If you will, please let me know down below with what you thought about this guy's position. Do you think that he's making good arguments, or do you think that he's just wrong, so very wrong about this shit? Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.